So it's my pleasure today to introduce Zainab Salbi, renowned humanitarian, author, activist and commentator who has dedicated herself to women's rights and freedoms. She's the founder of Women for Women International, a development organisation dedicated to helping women survivors of war rebuild their lives, providing the tools and resources necessary to help women and their families move from crisis to stability. She's the author of 3 books: bestseller Between Two Worlds, Escape from Tyranny, which focused on her own life and story, and The Other Side of War, and If You Knew Me, You Would Care, which tell the stories of some of the amazing women she's met through her work. Zainab has appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show 8 times and has featured widely in the international media, including in my own publication, The Guardian. She has recently stepped down as CEO of Women for Women International to focus on media in the Arab world, including a documentary on the role of women in the Arab Spring and the launch of the first media network aimed at women in the Arab world. So please join me and welcome Zainab Salbi. So Zainab, for the past 20 years or so, your work has focused on women from all over the world, from Kosovo to Rwanda. So what was it that inspired you now to turn your attention to the Arab world and the stories of the women here?
Well, several reasons. First of all, I'm from Iraq. I grew up in Iraq and spent half of my life from Iraq. So my core identity is I'm an Arab and a Muslim, and this is my part of the world, and I feel passionately about it. Then the turning point for me was the Arab revolutions. And regardless of how we feel about the Arab revolutions right now, women played a major role in it. And for the rest of the world, everyone was surprised by the role of women, and everyone was like, wow, we did not know Arab women have this public face and have this public participation. But for me as an Arab woman, I was like, no, actually, this is very normal for us to be outspoken and public and participate in the street, that this is not the story. The story is what's going to happen to Arab women afterwards. Are they going to be, continuing in their public participation in shaping the future, or are they going to be pushed back and told, thank you very much, go back home now, your job is done, as they have been in the past, in anti-colonial movement in the Arab world. And so so for me it became, okay, we've got to acknowledge the role of Arab women generally in our societies. As coming actually from an economic development perspective and backgrounds, I know for a fact, based on Goldman Sachs, based on the Economist Intelligence Unit, based on the World Bank, that the Arab economies cannot actually develop without the full inclusion of women in the economic workforce. So how do we include them, and how do we do, in what way do you do it economically? Do you do it through media? Do you do it through the NGO sector? And this time, for me, the route was actually media, because it's one way that you can spread the message in a faster way and show the possibilities of change from within the culture and within the culture and Islam, actually, and it's possible. And so that's, for me, is the shift of, moving from working with women from all over the world, from Afghanistan to Rwanda and Congo, as you said, to really coming to my home region and my people, if you may, to sort of say this is the time to actually really focus on Arab women. And because we cannot progress as generally, and I'm generalizing the Arab countries in here, but we cannot progress economically, socially, or politically without the full inclusion of women in the new picture.
Absolutely. And how are the media, again, generalizing the media across the region, how are they responding to this really new engaged female audience?
Well, so let's talk about here a couple of things. In terms of just numbers, we have 175 million women in the Arab world. In terms of just youthful women who are 18 to 34, it's estimated to have 65 million women. So there is a big number in here. There isn't much being addressed to them. There is an awareness, I would argue that relatively recent awareness that women have an important voice, that women are not happy with where they are right now in different countries, that they are not being represented in a complete, comprehensive way in the media, that they do not have political voices, that economically they're still facing some hurdles. So there is an acknowledgement, and this is from Booz Allen and different studies that are coming. I was saying that we realize that there is a gap in here, right? And this gap is a political gap, and it's an economic gap and media gap. There's also an understanding that we've got to cover this gap, and how do we do it? And the discrepancy for me is how do we do it in a way that deals with the full identity of an Arab woman. So a major consumer-oriented company, an international one, not to be, I would not want to name it, but they did a survey of Arab women, for example, and particularly of women in the Gulf. And the first question they asked them was their thoughts on makeup. But we are missing out actually on their multiple identities in here, and how do we address their multiple identities in a more comprehensive way than just the artificial way. So there is all of this to say is there are some media efforts that are trying to address. I would argue they're addressing the artificial aspect of it. They're addressing the makeup, the look, and all of that, which is every woman would like to do that. It's just, beauty is an important aspect of it, but that's not the full picture. So that's one thing. Second thing is that we're not having a full participation, again, of the full image of an Arab woman. A lot of women in the media, for example, they are being presented as anchors or as representatives, but they're not necessarily being included as political voice. What do they think about what's happening in the streets of Egypt or Tunisia or whatever countries? So they are more viewed as interviewers as opposed to a political voice in actually impacting. All of this for me to say is that I actually also believe that they are, though we're missing out on a very important voice in here, that they are really suggesting a new way, the youth generally and women in particular, as the most marginalized group of people in the Arab world generally. They're actually presenting a new voice in here, and a voice that is arguing for individual freedom and citizenship in new paradigms. And that rather than dismissing it and generalizing it and stereotyping it, we need to actually create a voice and a platform for them to hear what they're having to say, because they may be our hope for a progress in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about this voice has been identified, these women have identified the fact they have a voice and they are interested in far more than perhaps is being shown. But what frameworks do you feel in the long term will best support this ongoing amplification of the voices that are coming to the fore?
Well, the women are when you talk about social media, for example, so and if you take Facebook as an example, Facebook audience generally all over the world are 50% women, 50% men. But in the Arab region, it's only 30% women participating in Facebook. And when they are asked, why are you not participating fully in social media? So it's not that them, for example, let's just talk social media, for example. It's not that they are not participating in social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or different things. Mm-hmm. It's that there's still much less percentage of their participation than their average, average women in the rest of the world. And the number one reason what they talk about is actually cultural barrier. So they're still afraid of expressing themselves freely in the media because they're afraid of what the society will think about their views, what other readers are thinking about their views, whether their family prohibition of expressing their... So it's interesting for me that the number one obstacles that they are expressing is actually still societal norms, And I actually would say that the answer for this is there is a new technologies coming out that ensures anonymity of the participants. And I would be very high. I would say if there's one thing that will work in here to encourage more participation of women in the social media is the anonymity of their own voices, So there's cultural issues, there's family issues, education. We have 60% of university graduates in the Arab world are actually women. So it's not the education. It's not among the educated women. It is actually among the uneducated women that they're having discrepancy in terms of participation. So there is an opportunity in here, and the challenges are both qualitative and quantitative challenges, if you may. And for me, is the quality. How do we increase their percentages and to increase the percentage of their participation in social media, both for economic reasons or media reasons or voice or political reasons, is that we also need to address the cultural aspect of why they are not fully expressing themselves publicly.
So one of the things you say, it's not about the educated women, it's about filtering it down through. And you talk a lot about the power of storytelling and inspiration to further that conversation. And so what are your thoughts really on the specific role of the web and the social media and the networks on the creation of role models for women and enabling them and empowering them to inspire others?
Well, I think that's the most exciting thing, actually. So, the image of Arab women is still a very negative image outside of the Arab world. It's still people immediately think, a very sets of stereotypes of what an Arab woman is. And when you don't fulfill these stereotypes, you know, they look at you and they said, well, you're not normal. And I get that all the time. So I was like, no, believe me, every single woman I know in the Arab world is like, I mean, at least in my family or my friends, everyone is like me, you know. So, but no matter how much I was like, no, really, this is normal. There's a fit of stereotypes. So this is outside of the Arab world. I think part of the issue is that we have a distorted image of our own image as well. We have a distorted image of our own voices and our own beauty, if you may. And the question is, how do we revive our own, the image of a full Arab woman from within the culture and not necessarily outside the culture? You know, so there is the West and how the West sees Arab women, but there is Arab women and how do we see ourselves? And that's when I get excited, because the possibilities are limitless of how do you revive the stories from within. So take, for example, Rabi al-Adawiyya. You know, it's a mosque that was, you know, became the symbol of the fight between the Muslim Brotherhoods and military in Egypt, for example. And everyone thinks of Rabi al-Adawiyya as that political representation of the fight. Well, but Rabi al-Adawiyya is a woman, to start with, they named the mosque after her, which is a great story, just the second. But also, she is the first Muslim, not women, not men. She's the first Muslim to have introduced the concept of divine love. Love for God, not out of fearing hell, nor out of wanting heaven, but love for God out of love's sake, you know, out of just pure love for God. And she introduced that concept of love into mystic Islam, and introduced a whole new wave of theories, actually, within the relationship between the individual and God in Islam. And for me, she's a role model. You know, she's a role model that she provides us a new concept of Islam and a new concept of what it means a Muslim woman, and her love with the divine and all of these things. So, and this is just, I'm using this beside Khadija, Prophet Muhammad's wife. There's so many stories, actually, beside contemporary stories of women, of Arab women who are doing amazing work, but we don't see them on the media. We don't see the women in Lebanon who are clearing landmines, you know, in the south, or women who have done some amazing entrepreneurial projects in Egypt. We actually see more of them in the West than we see them in our own language and in our own platforms. And yet we cannot progress as a society, and we cannot evolve it if we don't start seeing that within our story. So you know, coming from 20 years of development and working in war zones, I learned to always say that there is a frontline discussion and a backline discussion. So if you look at war, there's always a frontline discussion of how war is seen as men see it, the fighting and the troops and all of that. And there's a backline discussion of war, which is how do you keep life going in the midst of war, and that is usually led by women. And that for us to understand how do you understand war and peace and the making of sustainable peace, that we actually need to include not only men's perspective, but women's perspective in the signing of peace, in the articulation of peace. Well, we are not, well, a lot of our countries, unfortunately, are in war, indeed, but also in terms of economic development, in terms of social progress, in terms of the digital revolution that is happening, all of these things. In order to understand how we can lift the whole society, we've got to include the backline discussion of the society, and that is the women's voices.
And so, do you feel in that, you know, your frontline and backline situations suggest that there is a really unique female style of communicating and of approaching situations? And so do you feel that the digital and the social worlds, which are very much about communication, collaboration, and connections between people to empower, do you feel that is more uniquely suited to a women's style of communication and also to leadership?
I mean, I am one of those people who say the digital world is a very important world, and it is an up-and-coming world, and it's progressing in ways some of us know, and some of us, we're still learning all of it. You know, we don't know where it's going to land, but it is progressing, and it's exciting, and it's fantastic. But I also worry about putting all our eggs in the digital world. Yeah. So if you look at digital penetration in the Arab world, the highest one is Saudi Arabia, which has 44% of digital penetration and usage. You know, and then it goes into the 20s in different countries. compared to TV, for example, where it is by far 97% of TV penetration. So I'm one of those people who says, do not put all the eggs in one basket, that we have to actually activate all of the issues, that we have to activate. The digital world provides a safe space for women to engage out of the private spheres of their domains, and it's opening a new doors for them that they didn't have otherwise, to engage in the world in new ways. You know, a lot of, especially women in post-revolutionary countries, from Tunisia to Libya to Egypt, they talk about a new voice where they say, we have crossed the line of fear. We have crossed the red line and we cannot go back. And so there's a new voice being articulated, and a lot of that because both of the revolutions, but because of their access to the digital world, and they see themselves as global citizens. So that's very important. But I also say, do not dismiss the rest of the population. And the rest of the population, it is, you know, still the taxi driver's wife is very, very important. And that at the end of the day, if we look at the Arab world in general, that we're still talking about not necessarily a wealthy population. We're still talking about a lot of poverty. A lot of the crisis that we're having is because of poverty and is because of economic situation. So how do we actually include different mediums to reach out to the public, you know, at the grassroots level? And TV becomes very, very important in that medium. You know, how do you reach and show the possibilities not only to the educated class, but to the uneducated class, you know? And in a very, very critical moment in history in our part of the world that is changing and is being articulated and reformed right now as we speak. And so I would say, you know, if we want to increase women in participation in the entrepreneurship in businesses, you know, then do it in different mediums. If we want to increase women's social and political voices, do it in different. Do not put it all on the social media, but do it in different distribution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is probably one of the last questions from me before we open up to the people here to join our conversation. But how do you feel that the region as a whole can actually ensure that the ground that has been won by women in having these conversations and entering different mediums to surface issues, how can we make sure that that ground isn't lost in a new wave of male-dominated structures?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. I mean, I have to say, my observation as someone who lives half in here, half in the Western world, is that there are two realities in here. So every time, so I'm doing a documentary, for example, on the role of Arab women in the Arab revolutions as one of the projects I'm working on. And every research that I look at it from the Western world, if I take any Arab country and I do all the research possible about who are the women in the Arab countries, it comes as stacked with a group of very impressive women who are actually writing and talking in English and French, and depends on the country, and it's amazing. And then I go to that country, Tunisia, as an example, or Egypt as an example. And I look at these women, and they're very exciting and all of that, but the local population do not, they're like, wait, let us tell you who we like.
Yeah.
And who they are liking is as actually very critical voices. These are women who are speaking and writing in Arabic, have millions of followers. They're not popping out into Western world because they're not speaking in English. They're even not popping out in pan-regional way because they're not speaking in Fusha. They're not speaking in they're not writing in standard Arabic. They're writing in colloquial Arabic, in their own dialect. And so, but they have millions of followers, and they are writing about their lives in real ways. So, you know, we look at politics, especially in this part of the region, as the frontline politics. You know, it's this president says to this president. They are writing about the backline politics, about garbage collections in Yemen. It's about, they're talking about marriage issues. They're talking about schooling. They're talking about teachers. They're talking about the backline of politics. But that is actually much, 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 much more important, or if not as important, in shaping the nature of the directions of the society. I argue we need to pay attention to women, not because of women. That's like the artificial way of looking at it. We need to pay attention to what women voices are saying, because they are simply the indicators for the national direction. They are like they're like the kitchen door. When something enters, when a new policy enters through the kitchen doors, no one pays attention to it. It's just like women. But it enters the house anyway. Did you see what I mean? So rather than we say, oh, it's just women, just a bunch of women, we actually need to look at what happens to women as an indicator for a national direction. And so I look at Hamas strategy, I look at Hezbollah. They're different, every government, and look at their strategy towards what's happening to women, and it will tell you what their strategies in the national direction. And so when I look at these women bloggers, and they are not the mainstream. They are not, the mainstream is actually, it's very, in a very, they are hired and fired, you know, and they don't have a voice. And when they do have a real voice, they get fired on that. There was actually a major case of Egyptian reporter making a story about prostitution in Egypt and how the police were part of the corruption. And rather than holding the police accountable, they fired the reporter. So there's a lot of such stories, you know, but yet we need to address these stories in order to progress the society. This is not about, you know, the big politics with the big P. This is about the small politics, and the women are writing about it in amazing ways. So how do we? The voices are there. It is they are not being cultivated in a united platform that can aggregate their voice and show it as a cohesive voice. You know, it's sort of drops of voices, and you need to do a lot of research and digging to understand what's happening. And one of the things that at least I'm trying to do is sort of aggregate these voices to see the sound that they are all talking about. And that sound is very important to the national directions of the region generally in terms of progress on a social and economic level.
Yeah, so it's not reinventing the wheel, it's identifying what's there, pulling it all together, building those bridges, the smaller bridges which will lead to the bigger bridges.
Absolutely. I mean, in many ways, what's the point of building big? I'm one of the people who build big bridges between the worlds, you know, and through Women for Women, and, you know, mobilize more than 500,000 women, and sent, you know, mobilize more than $100 million to women all over the world. But I came to the conclusion that in this part of the world, what's the point of focusing so much on big bridges, especially between the West and the East, when we really also equally need small bridges between us? That the learning and the progress is going to happen more likely from dialogues within Arab countries rather than from dialogues between the West and the East. You know, there is more likelihood for an Iraqi woman to be inspired by an Emirati woman than from an Iraqi woman to be inspired by an American woman. You know, for the same story. You know, and that if we want to actually push that moving forward and revive an old narrative of what it means to be an Arab woman, which is a very strong woman actually, and knows what she's doing and contributes positively to the society, we need to revive it from within the culture.
Wonderful. Now, I'm sure there are a number of people who want to join our conversation. Who wants to start us off? No one? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Georgia, and I was very interested when you were elaborating on the interconnection between within the Pan-Arab region rather than this bridge between the East and the West. And it's very interesting to me. And do you have any particular story of part of the world where this conversation is becoming really relevant? Because you have this bird-eye view about what's happening in the region. Is there any specific conversation that you can flag which is becoming relevant nowadays?
Well, so good catch, because, you know, the new fashion, I think, is to say all Arabs are very different, that every country is significantly different. I worry about a new trend, particularly in America, of the Arabic language is also different, and that we should no longer teach standard Arabic to our children, and that we need to teach our local dialect. And I think all of these things actually are very, very dangerous. And I would even dare to call it as a new form of colonialism, to even take the language and deconstruct it and start advocating for teaching Tunisians or Iraqi as opposed to Arabic, which we all studied for until now, you know. And so I argue, yes, we are different, of course, in our culture to a great extent, but to a certain extent. But the difference is 10%, is not 90%. That we actually share our same religion, same language, same songs, same laughter, same jokes, same. Okay, the food is a bit different, you know. I would advocate for Iraqi food, for example, but that's there is a difference in culture, but that difference is a smaller percentage than a larger percentage. So rather than all of a sudden make the small percentage every difference. I mean, it's like almost like politically correct thing to say every Arab country is different. I would say, no, we are different, of course, but there's a lot of similarities. So that's one. Second thing is, how do we, so the second thing, to exact answer or direct answer to your question is the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, the Arab revolutions, whatever you want to call it. But there's when you talk to bloggers, for example, from different countries, there is, you see a direct link actually and communication between the Tunisians and the Egyptians and the Libyans. Now that connection is a very discreet one and is very with very active bloggers and social media users, But they do have that linkage and they do see what happened in here and they try to replicate the campaigns in different countries, And then some of them succeed and some of them don't succeed. But if you see every single campaign that is happening in terms of political change, they are replicating each other. They just change the name. So this is already happening, So how do you lift it up in the positive stories? How do you revive the possibilities that look at what these women are doing? Because it's possibly, when these women are, when a woman from the same culture, the similarity of the culture, 90% of us are similar, right? In terms of when she is doing something within that, is more likely to inspire many more women to say, I can do that. Right now, what I hear from women is that they're saying, well, that's interesting because you can do whatever you want to do in the West. Yeah, I can do whatever I want to do in the West, but I am in here. And you need to talk with me in my cultural boundaries and in my cultural formats. And how can I do things in here? How can I express myself? So that's one thing. The second thing is we need to understand the nuances of what women are talking about, from not only political participation in countries like North Africa, not only really needing entrepreneurship or economic participation and acknowledging that they are 30% of the workforce in Egypt, for example, but the policies are not necessarily responding to the fact that women are 30% of the workforce, and we need to get laws and regulations that would encourage to keep them, first of all, because the economy will suffer if they leave, but to encourage more of them, So that's the second thing. But they're also talking about relationships and marriage and sexualities and all of these things. And in these formats, they have very limited guidance. For example, Egyptian women are talking about sexual harassments publicly. And they are talking about the rapes in Tahrir Square that is happening publicly. They are writing their testimonies on Facebook. This is individual acts and no one. But there is no platforms that can address to them the trauma that they are going through. How do they deal with their parents? How do they deal with their friends? There are actually no therapists who are equipped to deal with this new phenomena of women talking and not keeping their silence into their hearts. So, and the only platforms there is actually religious shows or religious figures who are either on an informal basis or on TV who are becoming the core guidance of what do I do with these things. Which I'm not going to dismiss, but I'm going to say we need to create also other voices, psychological voices, therapy, all of these things to guide women from other perspective rather than only religion, to how do they deal with these issues, because these are issues that are impacting a regular family in here. And so that's what we really, the discussion the culture has evolved in its practice, but the platforms have not evolved in addressing the culture.
I think we can maybe just fit one more quick question. Lady there in the black.
There are two ladies.
Hi, I'm Triska Hamid from The National. You talk about the role of TV in helping to develop the role of women and educators. How likely is that when the industry is still so heavily dominated by men interested in employing good-looking women and limiting them to the role of anchors, TV presenters, and fashion and makeup shows?
I think it is. I mean, I'm an optimist by definition, even though my last name means negative in Arabic. But I'm an optimist. I think there are good models where TV have succeeded. Now, not TV stations per se, but you have the Oprah Winfrey, for example, it's a succeeded phenomenon. There are Brazilian Women Network, for example, where they have created the platforms and discussing issues that you otherwise would not discuss. Whatever social issues. but doing it softly and through general entertainment. So I do think I think TV actually, I mean, there's a lot of research about that. From India, soap opera impacting, for example, birth rates in India, child education, domestic violence. There are statistics correlating between the Indian soap operas, the Brazilian soap operas, even the Turkish soap operas, actually, their impact on social behavior patterns. And so what we see as one thing of just a soap opera, and it just has cute-looking boys and girls in it, actually the stories behind it and the social research behind it, that they have created major trends in social behavior changes. So I'm actually a big believer in the possibilities of TV. The Turkish soap opera being the first ones in the Arab world who was being dubbed in Arabic and talking about a lot of the social norms and relationship, but using Islam or rather Muslim characters, in it, has created a wave of articles and research about their impact in the Arab world. And I know recent New York Times article about how they have the teenage girls who are being forced into arranged marriage in Iraq, for example, are quoting #1 reason of them trying to commit suicide to get out of the marriage or whatever it is as the Turkish soap opera. And I personally have encountered so many women who are talking about shifting, whether they're stopping domestic violence or sending their girls and boys to school, whatever, as quoting the Turkish soap opera as the major source for that behavior change.
Thank you. We're out of time now, but perhaps if there are any more questions, Zainab might be available after the session if we come through into the foyer. So please join me in thanking Zainab Salbi.